Today's lesson is section 1.3, 12 basic functions. We are going to look at the graph of these 12 functions along with their domain and ranges. The first function is called the identity function, f of x equals x, or y equals x. It is a linear function that goes through the origin. The domain and range are both negative infinity to infinity. Remember, domain we look left to right, range we look bottom to top. Next, we have the squaring function, f of x equals x squared. Here, the domain is still negative infinity to infinity. The range, however, is 0 to infinity, including 0. Notice the bracket. Okay, the graph does touch 0, so we do include it. Next, we have the cubing function, f of x equals x to the power of 3. Just like the identity function, the domain and range are both negative infinity to infinity. Here we have the reciprocal function, 1 over x. Since x is in the denominator, that creates problems and adds asymptotes to the graph. As you look at the domain and range, they both don't include 0. The domain and range is from negative infinity to 0, 0 to infinity. Next function is the square root function. Notice the square root function does not have any negatives in it, in the y value or in the x value. So the domain is from 0 to infinity. Range is also from 0 to infinity. We do include 0 in this function. If you plug 0 in here, you still get 0. Next, we have the exponential function, e to the power of x. Here, our domain is negative infinity to infinity. However, our range is 0 to infinity. We do not include 0 as it just approaches 0 but does not touch. The natural log function, ln of x, domain 0 to infinity, range negative infinity to infinity. Notice that this is the inverse or opposite of the exponential function. Next, we will have two trig functions that we're going to talk about. The first being sine. The sine of x. Notice that the sine goes through the origin, and it oscillates between -1 and 1. The domain would be negative infinity to infinity, but the range would be -1 to 1, including both -1 and 1. Now the cosine function is just like the sine function, goes from -1 to 1, but it is shifted either to the right or to the left by pi over 2. Notice that it doesn't go through the origin, but it does peak at 1. The domain and range are exactly the same as the sine function, negative infinity to infinity, and range -1 to 1. The absolute value function. Again, in your calculator, I put here ABS. That is in the math key if you're going to type this in your calculator. It looks like a V. Just like the square root or the squaring function, the domain is negative infinity to infinity. The range is 0 to infinity, including 0. The next function is called the greatest integer function, or the integer function. Again, in your calculator, it's under the math key, INT. This is also called a step function. As you can see, this is a function because of the open circle, closed circle, open circle, closed circle. The domain is still negative infinity to infinity, but this time the range is just all integers, which are positive or negative whole numbers. No fractions, no decimals. Logistic function, which is 1 over 1 plus e to the negative x. The domain, negative infinity to infinity. Range, 0 to 1. Notice we do not include 0 and 1. Now, the reason we are going to talk about continuity is in your homework, they're going to ask you questions on domain and range and also continuity. Just a reminder here, if a function is going to be considered continuous, the domain has to be from negative infinity to infinity. And that is the reason why we went over domain and range. Piecewise functions is something we are going to cover tomorrow in class together. We're going to go over some problems and discuss how to graph them. Your homework for tomorrow is page 109, now numbers 1 through 28. Again, most of this is talking about domain and range and continuity, looking at the 12 graphs that we just went over.